Go wild. Put us on. There's Amy.
All right.
Amy, get closer. We need you bigger in frame.
Okay.
There you go.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. Let's go wild. Let's go crazy. So excited to have everyone here. Hi, Amy. Didn't have a chance to welcome you. So excited you're here. My name is Anna Blanco, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Ocean Film Festival, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Q&A for the film Artifishal. Very excited to have all of you here. Before we get started, I just want to say, on behalf of the Film Festival, again, thank you for joining us. As most of you know, we were supposed to host our festival in person in March and had to postpone it. And here we are. One of the nicest things about being able to do a virtual film festival is that we get to have guests in from all over the world to participate in the Q&A. We also have a lot of guests tuning in live. So a big welcome to everyone around the world. And a little bit about the film festival. For those of you who haven't had a chance to join us in person or virtually for that matter, our goal is to use the power of film and the power of storytelling to help protect our oceans. This year on our virtual film festival, we had every single filmmaker come back and say, please, go ahead, share my film. I really want the story to be told. I want audiences around the world to be able to hear the story. So we're very lucky on that front. We also have over 14 Q&As, and we keep adding them because everybody wants to join us and have a wonderful conversation. So there's something for everyone, and the films are available until August 9th. So make sure you see the films. If you haven't seen Artifishal already, it's available till Sunday. The Q&As will be live on the website as well. And then we will host them on the International Ocean Film Festival website. So they will be with us for a while. So I'd like to go ahead and get us started. I'm just going to do a very brief intro of our moderator this afternoon. David McGuire is he's a friend. He's also the founder and director of Stewards, which is a project of the Earth Island Institute. David's also a strong advocate for sharks, and he is also a member of the International Ocean Film Festival Screening Committee. So he helps us select the films. He's also instrumental in helping us secure films about sharks. It's always one of our more popular programs at the festival, and we're delighted to have David online today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David. And since I know you have some clips to show, I'm going to make you a co-host of today's event so that you can actually manage the technology from your side.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, International Ocean Film Festival audience. And especially thanks to the fellow participants here and with Artifishal. So we wish we were with you all in presence. Here we are. This is my third Zoom today. I'm staring out at a kind of foggy sky, but I know it's out there on the other side of the glass, and hope to get out there and hope all of us can get out there again and be healthy and get in the ocean and work together to protect it. So this is my 13th year with the International Ocean Film Festival. I host the shark films, so I actually catalyzed that when we were doing the California shark fin ban 11 or 12 years ago. And I've had 4 films in it and several that I've worked on. And I nominated this film, Artifishal, when I saw it. And as Shark Stewards' mission is to restore the health of the ocean by protecting big fish like sharks from overfishing and the shark fin trade, but also protecting critical marine habitat. So it's very much in sympathy and along the same lines as this film by Josh, or AKA Bones Murphy. And we go way back, kind of worked on a little shark film together on a shark tournament, right, Josh?
Right.
And then you went on, and we're doing it already, and have made a lot of amazing feature-length films. You've won a lot of awards. And then this film, of course, sponsored by Patagonia, has really been successful, and it's been really great for groups like ours or groups like Circle or some of the other nonprofits trying to remove dams or protect salmon and use it as an advocacy piece much in the nature of Patagonia's work, saving wild places. And I wanted to start with you before we get to Amy Bowers Cordalis and some of the great work that she's done. And of course, she's in the film featured prominently, as are people in First Nations and in the Yurok tribe, which is a really interesting perspective when it comes to salmon in general, but also conservation at large. And we'll talk about conservation, and hopefully there'll be some questions from the audience coming through. Actually, I wanted to start out before I ask a question. If I can share my screen, it looks like I can. We'll start with a trailer. And as Anna said, you can watch the whole film with the Ocean Film Festival virtually until August 9th. And we encourage you to support independent film, independent filmmakers, and of course, independent film festivals like the Ocean Film Festival by joining, by donating if you can, or volunteering next year when we can all get together and celebrate in person. So I'm gonna just do a quick share on a short, and we'll watch the lead in to my busy desktop. And the opening of the film, Artificial.
How far do we go to manufacture wildness? It's not working.
The people want it to be wild, and that's what we're fighting for.
So there's a fish farm. So I really love that. It's a very powerful trailer, but that's a lead in. But it's a great quote by Aldo Leopold, who if you don't know, was a professor for the Department of Forestry in the mid 1900s at UC Berkeley, where I used to work, and wrote a very influential book called the Sand County Almanac about coexisting with nature, and just a really wonderful, not only scientist, but also poet almost as well. So Bones, now your company is called, your film production company is called Liars and Thieves. And it sounds like you're running for president, but what's the backstory behind that? And also, what inspired you? I heard the backmail rumor and Friends of Patagonia is your pitch to Yvon Chouinard, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, funny enough, the backstory to Liars and Thieves was we do a lot of work in advertising, and we decided we would just, call a spade and just recognize that, what we do in the ad world is sometimes a little different than what we do in the advocacy film world, shall we say. But we cast ourselves against type because we think that all creative begins with trust. And to be able to find people to be in a film like this, to be able to have somebody like Amy give us her time and her perspective, that all started with trust. And so we said, well, if we said, okay, trust us, we're super good guys, nobody would believe us. So we said, we'll just call ourselves a bunch of liars and thieves.
That's great.
And the Artificial had a really wonderful but very personal kind of beginning for me. So before I got into film, although growing up, Jacques Cousteau was my childhood idol, but before I got into film, I was a fisheries biologist, and I worked on a fish farm in Ireland, and I managed an on-campus fish hatchery at Humboldt State University. And then I went into film, and then made action sports ski film, because at the time I had been a professional skier, and then went on to make everything from really bad reality TV. I was young, I needed the money, and then went to documentary films, went to feature films and commercial work, and kind of began to really understand how to better tell these stories. And so years later, I met a friend of mine, Kate Williams, who's the head of 1% for the Planet, and she asked me if I would help her do a little retrospective piece on what Yvon Chouinard and Craig Matthews had accomplished in starting the nonprofit 1% for the Planet that encourages businesses and individuals to give 1% of their gross earnings to environmental organizations, because as Yvonne likes to say, there's no such thing as business on a dead planet. And so we were in Montana, and over lunch, midway through the shoot day, somebody just happened to say to Yvonne, what's your next film project? And Yvonne has a really wonderful way with words, and sometimes they're very few. And he said, well, it's a film about the arrogance of man. And that was about it. And everyone was like, and then he says, yeah, it's the way we're using like hatcheries and fish farms to unwild salmon and trout to some extent, and many other species. And it's really about the loss of respect for what wild means. And I remember thinking, I cannot believe you just said that. I mean, this is this whole thing I had started my career in. Then I go into film and come all the way back, and I'm sitting on the the tailgate of a truck in Montana. And he says, it's a film about basically what you've done for your whole life. And so over lunch, I just explained to him what my background was, and we just had a good chat. And then at the end of the day, he asked me if I had a card, and of course I didn't. Great timing. But he said, well, just give me your number. So I scribbled a piece of paper, like ripped it out of a notebook, handed it to me. He said, I'll call you. And that never happens. Nobody calls you when they say, I'll call you. And 2 days later, his producer called and said, Yvonne wants to know if you want to make this film. And I remember thinking, well, yes, but what is it? I mean, I had no idea. It was like a little chat over lunch. And they said, well, that's kind of up to you. We have a sketch. We have some ideas. But what do you think the film should be? And I said, well, give me a little beat to kind of work that out. And so started working on some ideas, and all the ideas kept coming back to connections people had with the subject matter, but they were all like what I like to say, people who are interested in just salmon as food and fun, not salmon as like how it's connected to somebody viscerally. And my wife is from Northern California in Arcata, and she had gone to high school with a number of Yurok kids. And she said, oh, you know what? You should call my friend and he can introduce you to some people up there, and you should go up to the Klamath. And I was like, that's a great idea. And so we asked Patagonia for a little teeny tiny bit of money to go shoot for 3 days and see if we could establish a little bit of a story. And so we showed up, started shooting around, and then the chairman of the tribe got word that we were there and said, come to my office. And we thought, oh, did we do something wrong? Oh no, oh. And so he very sternly sits us down and says, you're not supposed to be in Yurok country filming unless we say you can. And we're like, we're so sorry, we were told. And I said, well, this is what we're trying to do. And would you be interested in appearing in the film? He's like, maybe, but hold on a second. You need to talk to somebody. And in walks Amy Cordalis. And she said, hey, what are you guys doing? And we said, well, we're kind of starting this film and we don't know what it's going to be, but we kind of got an intro to here. And she's like, oh, well, let me look over everything and let's talk. And that began this process of getting to know not only Amy, but so many other wonderful people there on the Klamath that became our way of connecting with people who have a much deeper sense of what salmon, in this case, wildlife, really mean for humanity and mean for whole cultures.
That's a great story and a great introduction, and also a very hopeful note on how things can come together for the good. And obviously, Yvonne is a catalyzer in that, but
100%.
It's also an excellent segue into introducing Amy. And the interesting thing about Amy is that she's a fisherwoman and Yurok tribe member. And also the excuse of going to the Klamath at any time is a good excuse, because it's like one of the most beautiful places on the planet that also has some inherent threats, but also that Amy is an attorney and general counsel for the Yurok tribe. So it's funny that she kind of wandered in and asked, what are you guys doing? By the way, sign this contract. So Amy, it's
That's really what it was.
It's great to have you on the program. And we were talking earlier, I'm a fish guy, more of a salty fish with teeth, but I had this amazing connection. And I think connection is actually the story here, connection between us here and us and our audience and the film, but also with nature and with the ocean. And that's what salmon do. Like they connect the salmon to the fresh water, to the trees, to the forest, to the people, back to the ocean. I mean, it's this beautiful circularity. And if we can keep that going, we can keep this earth spinning and all of us upon it. So Amy, you started out as a fisherwoman with your father, is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about your past? And then maybe how'd you get into the film? I mean, besides telling Josh he's got a sign on the bottom line.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you across the world. And I want to thank the organizers for putting their hearts and their efforts into protecting our oceans, our salmon, our sharks, whatever it might be. We're at a critical time, and that kind of dedication from humanity is necessary. And also the film, let me put a plug in for the film. You got to watch the film. It has a really important message, and I'm excited we get to talk about that today. You know, I'm a Yurok tribal member. My family is from the village of Rekwa at the mouth of the Klamath River. And for our international audience, the Klamath River is in what I call northern California. The river meets the ocean about 50 miles south of the Oregon and California border. And the Klamath River historically was the third largest salmon producing river in all of North America. So when you think about salmon in the Pacific Ocean, you got to think about the Klamath, and what happens with the Klamath salmon greatly affects what happens with all of the salmon in North America. So it's an important species, and it's a very important species to my culture, to my tribe. We were never relocated. You know, a lot of Native American tribes in the process of colonization were relocated to other areas, but we were lucky to stay on the Klamath River in our Aboriginal territory. And so we were able to maintain our salmon way of life. And what that meant was that we fished all the time, and everything that we did in some way related to fish. And that was true for Aboriginal times, and it remains true today. And so the importance of salmon really can't be understated. One of the things we always talk about is how my ancestors really thrived and survived off the ancestors of the wild salmon that are in the Klamath River now. So in that way, you know, the people and the salmon had this relationship where they supported one another since time immemorial. And you know, think about that for a while and think about what that really means. One of the things that it means is that we spend today still a lot of time on the river fishing. Just yesterday, I was out fishing with my two young sons, and I just had a baby, and so the baby was in the pack, and we're in the boat, and we're checking the net, and it's a good time. But that's what we do. We know the river really well. We know the salmon well, and that kind of intimate relationship with the salmon in the river also allows us to know when things change or when things aren't doing well. And so, you know, right now, we can get into this a little later, but right now the salmon aren't doing well. We've had over the last 4 years, the lowest returning run sizes that we've ever had in history. And the tribal council has canceled our fishing seasons, and that's been just absolutely detrimental to our way of life, to the fabric of Yurok country and our community. So I was really happy to participate in this film because it gave us an opportunity to tell our story about how we interact with fish, which I think is really important to share with the world, that you know, you don't have to interact in a way with nature where it's just consumptive, right? Like, you can interact in a way that is sustainable and that is symbiotic and good. And you know, we were able to tell that story through the Artifishal film, but also, you know, we were able to talk about the role of hatcheries on the Klamath River.
And it was really powerful, and I think very personal as well, that it showed a lot of the activities of the Yurok, including this almost a coming of age ceremony, I think, with young men. Is it the stick
game?
Yeah, so very powerful, and the people that are in the film, as well as you, and you have an incredible voice, and very compelling, and your native wear. And I also want to congratulate you because Yurok tribe was awarded the United Nations Development Program prestigious Equator Prize, and you opened that up, and that was really compelling. So, you know, I think you have a very powerful presence in the film, but you also have a very powerful presence on the other side of the cultural equation, if you will, on the legal side. And your tribe and you in particular were involved with a lawsuit against the Board of Reclamation, because salmon are kind of like sharks. They're hit all around by many threats. You know, a lot of people are fishing, there's climate change, but really it's about water. I mean, again, coming back to connection, it's about water. And everything that happens upstream comes downstream. So can you tell us a little bit about what that threat is to salmon on the Klamath and your native life, and that connection to the salmon, and how you are working to mitigate those factors upstream?
Thank you. Absolutely. So the biggest problem for our Klamath River salmon, and I want to start by noting that we had salmon in the river really from as early as early May through late October. And then for the rest of the year, there were steelhead and trout and candlefish and all kinds of other fish. But, you know, we have about 3 good, solid, historically, 3 solid runs of salmon in the river. And so salmon need water, right? And they need solid habitat. And the biggest problem, the biggest threat for our Klamath River salmon now is bad habitat. And bad habitat right now is created by lack of water and then also by dams. The lack of water problem comes from multiple consumptive uses, demands between agriculture mostly. You talked about the lawsuit. We've actually brought 2 different lawsuits in the last 3 years against the Bureau of Reclamation for violating the Endangered Species Act. At the core, what those lawsuits claim is that the Bureau of Reclamation, which manages the flows on the Klamath River and divides the water between water for irrigation, water for the Klamath Lake, and then water for the Klamath River, that in dividing that water, they didn't give enough water to the coho salmon in order to protect those salmon. Coho salmon are listed on the Endangered Species Act in the Klamath River. And so we basically said, hey, you've got to give us more water. Another layer to that is that the lack of water, the poor habitat, was creating a fish disease that in the last 3 or 4 years has been killing up to 90% of the baby salmon. I like to call the little reds and smolts that go down the baby salmon. But basically this fish disease was killing the baby salmon. And so the fish disease is fleshed out when there are adequate winter flows, when there's adequate, spring flows through high rains. But because the Bureau of Reclamation really controls the water flows, they weren't giving it enough water. And so our first lawsuit we won, we got more water in the river, salmon did better. But then the feds kind of went rogue again, came up with a new biological opinion. And then in the new biological opinion, we had to sue them again. And so we got a decision from the lower court, which actually was favorable, but then the irrigators and the feds appealed that. And so that case is currently pending right now.
Well, congratulations, and keep at it. And if there's some way that we can get our audience to support you in this, I mean, obvious as voters, I think our governor's in support of it. In the film, we had Jerry Brown. I missed him. We still miss him, but I think our governor's been doing a really good job in this crisis. And he just sent out an appeal to Warren Buffett to kind of get people going to remove those dams off the Klamath. So hopefully we can get enough public opinion to help out on the upstream side while you're working in the courts.
Yeah, that's great.
One thing I would point out too, which is this is kind of at the core of the film, which is that the only real reason that dams on the Klamath were built in other rivers was because we believed in this myth of hatcheries. We believe that, okay, as long as we are going to build the dam, we'll be fine. We have hatcheries. It'll be great. And by the way, we're probably just going to make fall run Chinook because they're easy and fast for us. We're not going to make spring run. We're not going to make summer run. We're just going to make fall run Chinook. Everyone will be happy. And so many dams were actually encouraged by the use of hatcheries. And I think that's what people forget. They'll say, no, hatcheries sustain our local populations who are fishers, who have small businesses, who have boat payments, et cetera. Well, you never needed hatcheries before you had dams. And so it was only by encouraging use of hatchery and belief in them that we then got these dams, because otherwise it would have just killed the fish off completely. And all of those constituents would have said, hell no, don't do it. You cannot do that. And so the big problem with the Klamath dams, of course, is that they never allowed fish passage. So there's no way, there's no fish ladder to get up and over the Klamath dams. And that's something that when it came up for relicensing, they said, you either put in fish passage so these fish can migrate where they normally would, or we're not going to give you your license. And that's kind of what's happened. But it's so interesting that beforehand, they were fine with just us manufacturing farmed fish essentially and releasing them into a river and saying everyone's good, right? And that's kind of what we were trying to get to in the film, which was this idea that hatcheries were supposed to be great. And then we realized, in fact, they're a problem.
Yeah, I think it's, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, Bones is raising an incredibly important point about public information. So hatcheries don't work. They are not good mitigation for dams, right? And we know enough now that you can't build a dam and, you know, ruin salmon habitat, put in a hatchery, and then have salmon populations thrive. So we know that needs to now be our baseline. So then the next step needs to be removing those dams, restoring the natural hydrology, and that's how you're going to restore your rivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think Yvonne says it really well that we're devolving our fish by diluting the genetic stock. I was astounded, one of the facts in the film, that in the Pacific, if you include the Pacific Northwest, Japan, and Russia, 5 billion fish are released in the Pacific that are from hatcheries. So they far outnumber the wild stock, which are in trouble themselves. Many species are endangered. I looked at a Fish and Wildlife survey that was old, and over half the stocks, because under the ESA, you look, endangered species actually look at stocks and protect them. Over half the stocks of salmon are endangered or extinct. I mean, that's a lot. That is really formidable. So
yeah,
it's,
I mean, one thing too, like Alaska, we think of Alaska as being wild Alaskan salmon, but Alaska has the biggest hatchery program in the country. 1.8 billion fish are raised and released in Alaska. And that's when people go, wait a minute, I thought Alaska was all wonderful environment and everything. They just want more fish and they do so really for economic reasons. And so the whole idea of what is wild is becoming diluted, as is the genetic stock. And more recently, I've kind of been pointing out to people that we have almost no protections for what is wild, specifically not a wild fish. I mean, tomatoes have more protection because we know what an organic tomato is and a non-organic tomato, and that's covered by law. But we can't say what's a wild fish and what's a farmed or a hatchery fish. There's no designation. So it's just lumped in as fish. And that's a real problem because people don't recognize the value of wild fish, which were self-sustaining, just like the shark that's behind you. We don't have hatcheries for sharks.
no.
We don't have hatcheries.
They give live birth.
Yeah, we don't have hatcheries
Right.
for elk. We don't have hatcheries for deer. I mean, we tried a hatchery program for waterfowl, ducks and geese around the turn of the century, and it failed miserably. And they said, you know what, let's set aside land as refuges to let them do what they do. Let nature be nature. And that's the same thing with marine protected areas. We're saying, allow these places, remove mankind from them and watch what happens. And when we do that, it's amazing what happens. And people forget that all of the engineering prowess we have, we cannot build a tree. A tree grows because we put a seed in the ground and we let sun and water do its thing. And humans think, no, we can put people on the moon, we're going to Mars. But there are some things that nature is just so much better at than us and always will be. And that's what we have to kind of get back to recognizing, is where we think that humans can fix everything when we can't. and recognizing the power of nature, not just as a hippy dippy thing, but really because we should be honoring that and allowing that to happen.
Yeah, I think you touched on a little bit earlier that the subsidies that go into these dams, that these fish for recreation and commercial use that in turn come to the consumers are costing hundreds, if not $1,000 a piece, whereas it's much less expensive to just let the fish do their thing in the wild and come up the river without the dam. And then all of this money that's being invested in dam removal and habitat restoration associated with it. So I know that Matt Stoker was, he was an advisor on the film, right? And he did Damnation, and we know him from way back in Ventura, and now he's got a PhD and does a lot of work actually. And we were just working with my partner on the Santa Clara River doing this restoration, removing invasives, trying to get rid of the upstream impacts so that some of the salmon might be able to come back into these rivers. You know, Coho even went as far south, I think, as Malibu and Malibu Creek and the Miwok Indians. There's middens back there, and that was a big part of their subsistence all the way up, you know, to Big Sur, however, pretty big range of the coast. So it's funny how Yvonne says it well, you know, we manipulate nature so much. Or I think maybe it was Carl Safina in the film, who's another amazing scientist, who was also in a film in the Ocean Film Festival a few years ago on bluefin. And he's written several books, and I forget what the name of his latest book. We'll have to give it a plug. I'll find it before it's over. But he did Song for the Blue Ocean, which really influenced me. But he also got into tuna farming and wild fish, which is very analogous. So let's talk about farm fish now, because you go into that in the film as well, which is also, you look at the health effects, the impacts like on the river with the diseases, the sea lice. So you want to talk a little bit about farm fish, and is that good or bad?
Yeah, I'll preface that with a much deeper philosophic thought, because you referenced Carl, who's a very dear friend of mine. And I think Carl always asks us to think larger than we ever allow ourselves to. But something that I realized in kind of researching and making the film was that there are so many different ways to look at this issue. And when I really pared down, why do we see it this way? Why have we come up with this norm? And then it became kind of very clear and contrasted to, for example, the traditions of Yurok people, which is that if you just look to like Judeo-Christian theology, you find this thing called the dominion mandate. And that's from Genesis 1:28. And it says, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, which we did, and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over all of the fish of the sea and all the fowl of the air and every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And so when you think about that, our traditions in Judeo-Christian groups is make everything for us. And you look at that differently, for example, than the creation story of Yurok people that said they are one of us and they actually allowed us to be here. We owe them something in return. That's a totally different way of looking at the world. When you look at it with this dominion idea and idealism, then you start to say, yeah, manufacturing fish and putting them in the river because we, killed the river with the dam makes a lot of sense. And fish farms, same thing. There's something just recently, Paul Greenberg, who's an author, noted author, wrote the Omega Principle. He said more recently that on the Columbia River system, that there was enough fish back then, this is pre-dams on the Columbia, to provide all of the supply, or all the demand, I should say, in North America, and still replenish themselves. They had over 12 million fish returning, sometimes up to 22 million fish. So had we not destroyed that river, there would be no reason for fish farms. But fish farms is about demand. And fish farms is about saying that we're asking these natural things for too much. We can't rely on nature to give us enough. We want more and more and more, which is why we have hatcheries. We can't allow a river just to be a river because everybody wants to go home with 6 fish and have a big stringer and show up. There's just too much demand. So fish farm on paper can be possibly good. I've worked in one, right? But there's a lot of nuance to it. So people say farm bad, wild good. It's not quite that easy. So land-based fish farms can be good. There's one actually that's proposed right in Arcata not far from where Amy is. And that's an Atlantic salmon farm on land, which means just like a municipal water treatment system, they can control everything that goes in and goes out. And so something good there because we're providing protein. However, what people don't realize is that what mostly feeds those fish is other ground up fish.
Mhm.
So now we're harvesting wild fish like anchovies to feed to farmed fish, even if they're on land. And so we're basically robbing the ocean again to feed this very elitist food. I mean, farmed salmon is not cheap at all. And when people say we're feeding the world with it, we're not feeding the world with farmed salmon. We're feeding the 1% of 1%ers that can pay 17 bucks a pound. So yes, there's opportunities. There could be and will be ways to do fish farming well, but we have to decouple the food systems from wild sources as much as possible, because otherwise we are just doing a disservice to the very thing that we are, hopefully mitigating by having a fish farm. So you have to ask people, where does the fish come from? Where does the feed come from? Is the company reputable? What do I know about them? You can't just say, yep, great, fish, I'm happy. And so I wish it was easy because all of this stuff takes research and thought. And sometimes you just want to kind of like sit down and have a nice meal. But I think it's incumbent upon us to ask these really difficult questions and then follow our hearts and say what's important to us as consumers and what do we support, what do we not support.
Yeah, well said. Paul Greenberg also wrote For Fish, and he talks quite a bit about salmon farming. And I was wondering if you know, because I want to follow up with a question with Amy, but Kenny Baloff, who has fish in Sausalito, I did a little project with him, and there's a fish farm up in outside of Markleyville. And when we got involved, it's for fish, trout, rainbow trout for the lakes. And then most of the year it was just running. And so he went, can we farm some fish there? And they actually substituted the meal, and we looked at it, had a lot of mercury in it. And then you have this conversion ratio, which is actually much better than tuna, which is more like 10 to 1. I think it's more like 1.2 or 1.6 to 1. But you're still killing the best fish like anchovies, which are healthier than salmon or about anything else, low on the food chain, and taking away from all those other fish and animals out there or people. But they substitute it with an algae diet.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's a closed circuit system that's renewable, that actually captures all the nutrients. There, like, as you say, there are ways that you can do it, but they're generally smaller scale.
Right. Right. I mean, the funny thing is the conversion ratio people will point to with like a cow, and they'll say, how much energy, grass, for example, does it take to make a pound of meat from a cow? And then they say, look, it takes like, and I'm going to quote it wrong, but say it's 20 pounds of grass to make 1 pound of cow. And look, that's a terrible ratio, right? But one thing to realize is that grass is basically, it's just the sun.
Mhm.
It's like the grass grows, as long as you're treating it well, the grass grows, you make cow. When you're feeding this ratio of 1.1 or 1.2 to 1, it's because you're basically feeding bacon to pigs. You're basically taking a meat product, which has been eating the stuff like, the phytoplankton in the ocean, and then serving it to the fish. So the conversion ratio always works out better because it's such a high protein diet that they're getting. Whereas normally they still have to rely on something at that lower trophic level that's still eating, the grass, basically, the phytoplankton, the stuff that converts from sun. And so it's important, I think, for people to recognize too, that the ratios are relative, but we have to ask what is in each of those meals that make the proportional kind of protein at the end.
Yeah, well, I think it's good to always connect ourselves with our food and where it comes from. And Americans in general don't very well. It's so processed or marketed. But kind of going back to the spiritual thing, Amy, we worked at Wild and Scenic and with a group called Circle, which is Save the Yuba River Coalition. And they want to remove basically debris dams that were put up to keep downstream towns from getting washed away during placer mining, another just heinous practice for gold that filled the San Francisco Bay with sediments and contaminants. But there was this tradition called running the fish, and when the first fish appeared, I think the young men would get a fish and they'd run it upstream to the chiefs or the other tribes saying the fish have come, and it was a celebration. and they would let so many pass before they would harvest. Is there something similar to that, some kind of ceremony or celebration that the Yurok have for the arrival of the fish?
Yeah, we had the first salmon ceremony, and there was a certain family that had the right to catch the first salmon. And historically, the salmon were so plentiful that you could see them moving through the mouth of the river. And so the people would say, oh, the salmon are coming. And so all the families would come down to the mouth of the river, which is a long beach, and you've got great ocean on one side, and then the estuary of the Klamath on the other side of the sandbar. And so the families would come down, and they would basically set up camp. And I kind of look at it as more of like a festival, like how we know festivals today, than a ceremony, because it was a real celebration of the salmon coming home. And, the family with the rights to catch the first salmon would catch that. And then the other families would go behind and then catch their salmon. And then they'd go back to their camps, and they'd all cook the salmon, and they'd have a big feast, and there'd be all kinds of families down there. And people would just sit around the river bar and have a great time. But it was really a way of like honoring and acknowledging that important role that the salmon played in feeding the people. So yes, absolutely, that's something that happened.
That's really cool. I think it's in a way it's honoring, but it's also celebrating, and
Yeah.
It's like real Thanksgiving, right?
Well, and it kind of goes back to how Yurok interacted with fish, and I think that's one of the most important parts of the film, because it helps share with the rest of the world another way of interacting with salmon, right? Like with Yurok people, we were trained on how to interact with salmon, when you catch them, when you don't catch them, where you catch them, how to catch them, so that you allow some to go up the river. We even had like laws that were in place that basically made sure that some fish got up the river to the families upriver, right? In Yurok law, a fishing hole was owned as a property right. And the rights associated with property ownership now were carried with those historical ownership rights of a fishing place, right? And so people who fished downriver and had an actual fishing hole would make sure they only caught as much as they needed to feed their immediate families, and then allowed some to go up the river, so that families with fishing holes up the river would still have enough fish. And we wouldn't fish at certain times of the year. And one of the big things too is that our men did most of the fishing historically, and they would fast before they went fishing. So they wouldn't eat anything, and they would pray. And they would pray that they would have a good catch, and they would fast to basically like kind of give something to the creator, to say, I'm willing to give up this in order to have this great return of food and salmon. And so it really was a very, it's beautiful, and it's also very respected, right? Like the people trained, and then they fasted, and they prayed, and then they went and fished, and they only fished in this certain way. And I think today, those kinds of principles of how we interact with the natural world, not just the environment, are really important. Could you imagine public education that talked about like, how to grow vegetables, and when to grow them, and where to grow them, or even like where to find wild foods? Not just salmon, but in the forest, right? Like, what if we actually had public education that focused on that in like the K through, 6th grade level, so that people understood how the natural world works, and when it is appropriate for humans to interact with that natural world, and then how to do it in a sustainable way. And Patagonia's work, your work, David, Josh's work, my work is all about kind of trying to show people that we don't have to continue to live in this way that is just take from the natural environment whenever we want, right? We can self-regulate the way that we interact through our the way that we use nature, the way that we choose to buy products, what we choose to eat, all of that. and so there's a whole nother way. And I think through, all this equity work with racial justice, with all this, the environmental justice, social justice, like those different ways, those different narratives are coming to life, and we can all benefit from those, and really improve how humans interact and help save our planet.
I hope so. And I think, with COVID, hopefully people will be more aware of their actions and health, right? I mean, I'm very cognizant. I'm a pretty healthy person. I love fish, but I don't love to eat them because I live with them and I respect them, and they have faces, and I like to be with them and look at them, especially salmon. It's really cool to be in the water with salmon.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And you see this presence and this, this sentience. There is definitely, 6 million years of evolution of these fish, so adapted. And if people don't know, they're called an andromous fish, that they're born in freshwater, they go down the river, they feed, they come back to their native streams. So way out in that big pool in the milieu of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds or even thousands of miles away, and somehow they can find their way, and they've got this genetic imprinting, which is what makes it so important that we have habitats that are protected and not just one place or one pool or hatchery. Because each one of these fish, Carlos Garza was in the film, who actually I knew from UC Berkeley, and he's with NOAA, and he's done the genetics on all the salmons and how diverse it is just in California. And just one species of fish, they're so different. So if you wipe out one, it's gone forever. And so having that connection, not only now, but also through time, and through history. And one thing I wanted to add, because I was thinking in the film, about the dead fish and those crazy scenes, the fish drop or whatever it is, and the stupid fish cannon with John Oliver, he's hilarious, but that's absolutely absurd. That's a living animal, right? But the frozen fish that they drop, I guess after they've taken the sperm or the milk and the eggs out of for hatcheries, and they freeze this meat, and the kids throw it in the river, and it's so like ironic and paradoxical. It's like, what the hell, right? This fish swam up the river, they strip it of their gonads, and now they have these kids throwing their corpses back in the river when they could have just, some would die as adults, but it's not quite the full circle of life. But the one little girl says it so well, like she's just trying to figure the whole thing out, and you see it alive. That's such a powerful moment, Josh, when you just got this kid going, somehow this seems wrong.
One of the key kind of foundations of the film was like investigating the techno arrogance of humans. And we at one point got very concerned that the film really wasn't doing what we wanted to do. And then we were like, let's stop back, think about this. What is this film really about? And we read this article by Ira Glass, who does This American Life. And he said he's bombarded with stories all the time, and he has to kind of search through that and find what is the moment of joy that gets him excited about a story. And that's where he starts his storytelling. And we said, well, what do we have? And we said, well, we've got all these absurdities. We've got all these crazy things, like a cannon that fires them over, and trucks that drive them around, and planes that fly them into. And we said, well, why don't we celebrate that? And I remember talking to Laura Wagner, our producer, and I said, look at this thing I found. And this is this forklift that's lifting up this block of salmon, and waits, and then drops and crash, and it blows apart. And of course they give them to the kids to throw in the water. I was like, we need to go film this. And she's like, oh my God, I've never seen anything so ridiculous as that. And so we just, winging a prayer, went up there, told this group that's doing wonderful work to try to educate children about the issues, who are actually encouraging this, but I think it's because they didn't really know what they were talking about, is taking these hatchery salmon, which aren't even really from the river. They return to it because they've been manufactured to do so, but there's then encouraging them to kind of give back. And we shot all day, and we just kept looking for who are interesting people, who are kind of what I call like these little moments of light. And we kept seeing this one girl, and she just had this really kind of interesting energy. We certainly filmed other people that day. And then just as we were leaving, I said to the teacher, can I have like 3 kids to interview just for a little couple comments? And she's like, yeah, which ones? And I was like, that one there, definitely her, and that one there. And they came up, and each one said like 5 minutes of like what was important. And I just remember asking her, like, what do you think about this? And she just went blah and laid that out there. And then she said, bye. And she left. And August, who's the cinematographer, and I looked at each other like, I cannot believe that just happened. Like, unprompted, she just said the whole film in like 30 seconds. She summed up the whole thing, which is like, why don't we just let the salmon run? Why are we doing this? And then she just left. And the really funny anecdote was that as we started showing the film, we premiered at Tribeca, but before that, we started showing it in Patagonia stores, that every time Zoe would show up and say her bit, people would get up out of their seats and clap and applaud. And we thought, okay, when we go to premiere at Tribeca, which was a really big thing for us to earn the opportunity to be there, I said, I wonder if we could find Zoe and see if she would come. And so we contacted the school district, and she had left. They'd moved away. Nobody knew where she was. We looked for her, no joke, a year. Turns out she had moved to the East Coast, and we found her mom, and we said, your daughter's in this movie. Would you come to the premiere in Tribeca? Amy was there as well. And at the end of the Q&A, I said, we have a very special guest. And we offered Zoe to come up. And I remember thinking, I'm about to hand this girl the microphone, and I have no idea what she's going to say. I've known her for like maybe 5 minutes ever. And she was so eloquent even then. And she was a 6th grader on that trip when most of the kids were 7th and 8th. But she was so enthralled with salmon, she demanded to go on the trip, even though she wasn't supposed to go. And she got up in front of this group in New York at the Tribeca Film Festival and just greased it. And just, again, totally understood how this whole thing works. And going back to what Amy said, I wish more kids had that. I wish more kids had that sense of how this whole thing works, because I think we're so separated from this now that we just don't have that, the real honor of understanding our connection and our place in the world.
And just playing off that, that really was a special moment. But I also think film is so important in being able to tell people a story and enlighten people about issues from different perspectives in a non-controversial way. Because I think from a policy and law perspective, and just from a sort of where we are perspective, one of the biggest problems is, so a lot of dams, including the ones on the Klamath, really have no purpose anymore. They don't generate electricity. They don't really protect from flood. There's really no point, but we're so entranced in everything related to the dams operations, the hatcheries, the funding, the laws supporting it. It's all this stuff that sort of just hits the nail in deeper and deeper, that it's really hard for us to get out and get to this place that this 6th grader was so greatly identifying as like, why don't we just let the salmon do what they do? You know, and really that's what like the Yurok people always advocate for, is like, let this natural system do its thing. You know, we're a part of that natural environment, but still, like, if we put it back, if we, you know, free the river from the dams, if we let the natural hydrology flow, if we clean up the water, build, you know, the little creeks and build salmon playgrounds, for example, do that in-stream restoration work, this will all function as it was supposed to. And I think earlier there was mention about, you know, how important how important and how interconnected different ecosystems are. Once you start rebuilding the river, especially for a salmon run like the Klamath has, then that starts influencing the oceans, right? Because salmon, of course, are you know, food for larger predators. And one of the things that has happened recently on the Klamath is, not on the Klamath, but on the ocean, right out just in front of where, you know, the Klamath hits the Pacific, our Southern Oregon orca populations are going extinct. I think there's only like 74 left in the pod that is largely dependent upon Klamath River salmon. And one of the major contributing factors to their demise is lack of food. And that's because they don't have access to the salmon that they used to. You know, so once the salmon go away, you start affecting the other ecosystems that are dependent upon them. And that's what's kind of scary, right? Because if one falls, then it's like the domino effect and everything starts falling apart. So it's dangerous, and that's why we should all care. That's why we should all, think about our choices and how we interact with the natural world. We should encourage Warren Buffett and Pacificor to remove those dams. We should have more conversations like this so that people know what's going on, because we can still save those natural environments, and we can still save those ecosystems. But our window of opportunity is going to go faster than we know.
Yeah, we were definitely at a critical time.
Mhm.
I love the thought. I mean, congratulations, you're a new mother. And, we have so much hope in our children. And if we don't pollute their minds, we have so much to learn from youth and a youthful point of view, as Zoe showed us in the film. And they can be so unfiltered and so pure in their thoughts. And it's like, you're right. What were we thinking? Why did we put this dam here? So there's a lot that we can learn, and maybe we can learn a lot by becoming more childlike and appreciating and experiencing nature. I kind of go back to this COVID thing, which has made me more introspective. I do a lot less teaching and face-to-face. And, the thing that nourishes me is nature, is the ocean, and indirectly all of us. I was thinking, you had Ken Balcom in the film, who I knew. He was one of Ken Norris's students who I had classes with, UC Santa Cruz, and he was a very famous whale biologist, as Ken is up in the Pacific Northwest, and looking at the Salish Sea and the tribal nations up there and the interdependence on the salmon. And in the film, it shows the orcas starving that are so dependent upon this food source, as are the people. And we all connect with whales, save the whales. We love whales, and we're completely galvanized and appalled when we see a whale being killed, and all the energy around films like The Cove and some of these brutalities that were to animals that we feel very close to, and also many people, they are very symbolic. And there is that interconnectivity to what they eat as well. So saving salmon can save whales.
Yeah.
Saving rivers can save salmon, that can save whales.
Yeah. Yes.
So it kind of comes back to that connectivity. I don't think we have any questions coming in. The film is so deep, so rich. I encourage everyone to see Artifishal. It's online until August 9th. There are other ways that you can see it. Liars and Thieves. I don't know if you have it on your website, but I looked at your trailer, Josh, and it's really funny and really amazing, actually. You do some extraordinary work.
Yeah.
So I just we're going to wrap it up in a couple of minutes. I was just wondering if maybe each of you have kind of a closing statement. Is there any kind of take action, any way that our audience can support you, how we can continue to work together with the International Ocean Film Festival and make this wrong right?
Yeah, I would say the first thing you can do wherever you are in the world is touch the water around you and say, how do I protect this here in my backyard first? Because I think that's the most it's the most palpable way to actually recognize that there is something at stake here, and it doesn't have to be salmon. I mean, there are a whole bunch of endangered freshwater ecosystems. In fact, freshwater right now is at more risk than saltwater in many ways. But I would say more directly than that, and specifically connected to the film, the Klamath River presents an amazing opportunity because, as Amy mentioned, it was the third largest producer of salmon in the lower 48. And so that was Columbia River, Sacramento River, and Klamath. The Columbia and Sacramentos are so degraded that there's a long, long way, if ever, that we can reclaim any of those. But the Klamath is different. The Klamath represents an amazing opportunity. And not only does it represent an amazing opportunity for freeing the river through the removal of dams, but it could actually become the biggest producer of wild salmon on the entire lower 48. And that is, and it's this close, it's so close. There's right now a part of the removal plan that says that hatcheries after dam removal will operate for 8 years. And that was a negotiated point. There's a lot of people that wish they wouldn't. They would just free the river, free the salmon. But there's still some of these deals were negotiated 25 years ago when they were talking about originally removing dams, and they've been kind of working towards it. So hopefully we can limit it to that, and then the river can be wild, and that we can actually see what a wild river does. And I hope that anybody, certainly in California, but nationally and globally, can help what the Yurok are doing to really advocate for this river, because it is so close to happening. And it just needs our support with senators, Congress people saying, how do we get this over the top? Because if this happens, it will be the largest river restoration in history ever. And I would love to be there with people in the film, with Amy, with other people from the Yurok tribe, with other people that helped make the film, celebrating when we watch the first dam goes. That's what I'm looking forward to. And then watching the future of this wild river. And I hope you guys can all help us if you can.
Great. Amy, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think Josh was right on point, and I'll just add to that. Dams on the Klamath River, there are 4 that are scheduled to come down in 2022. And when we are successful, that will be the largest dam removal project in history. We're at a critical juncture where we just met a regulatory timeframe. And what we need now is encouragement from our senators, our representatives, from business leaders, from everyday folks from around the world, to Pacificor, who owns the dam, to remove those dams. So anyone who feels so inclined, write a letter to Pacificor, write a letter to Warren Buffett, whose company owns Pacificor, and tell them to take down those dams. Because we do have a huge opportunity to save wild salmon, to restore the river, to save the tribal cultures that are so dependent upon those salmon. And when we save those salmon, it's not only for Yurok people, but it's for people of the world, because we can all go and enjoy those fish. We can enjoy a clean, wild, free-flowing Klamath River. So I encourage everyone to join the Yurok tribe, to join Josh, to join David, all these folks who are working really hard on the Klamath, but also in other areas to save critical habitats that support not only sharks, but salmon too. So thank you.
Well said, and thank you. And I also wanted to let you guys know, if you don't know already, that we awarded you the Golden Gate Award for Artifishal. So congratulations on that award for an amazing film. And we hope to give it to you in person next year when we all get together and celebrate health and ocean health and river health and the removal of those dams. If there's not a petition up, we'll put one up, and we'll put it on the International Ocean Film Festival page and share it through various social media outlets. And I want to close, first of all, with thanks to the audience, thanks to the International Ocean Film Festival for hosting this, especially to independent filmmakers like Josh and all of the filmmakers who submitted to the festival every year to share their art, to share their passion, to share their stories, and to share their love for the ocean and all things connected. So we had a great connection today. So I want to leave a thought, somebody who's inspired me, and I'm sure all of you here, from Yvon Chouinard, Patagonia founder. And this is associated, I think this is in the description of the film, but if we value wild salmon, we need to do something now. Life without wild nature and a life without these iconic species is an impoverished life.
Wait a minute to do the video until.
If we lose all wild species, we're going to lose ourselves. It looks like Anna's on.
Thank you for those words.
Yes,
And thank you for having us here. Wild Matters really does.
it does.
Thank you. And Carl's book, I found it, is Becoming Wild. It just came out, and he's a great writer and a big champion for the ocean and film. He's been